right, in this next one, we're going to talk about all the other pieces. Now, we named some of these components, and some you might already kind of have in your head. You might already be thinking about that go along with the skin, but now we're going to talk about them in some sort of detail. So we're going to talk about the accessory structures of the skin. We're going to look at hair and nails and their structure and function, and then also get into some sweat glands and sebaceous glands as well. Right, so we're talking about accessory structures of the skin, things like hair, things like your nails, your toenails, your fingernails, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands or oil glands. So let's start with hair. Why do we even have it? What's the whole point of having hair besides to look cool? It is protective and does give us sensory input, right? If something pulls on your hair, you can feel it, right? You can't feel getting like a haircut. Ouch, that would be horrible if we could. But we do get some sensory input from the hair, like if something crawls across your arm like a little insect, right, and it's super light, but it moves the hairs on your arm, you're gonna notice that, right? You're gonna notice, and you're probably gonna slap it because you're thinking it's like a mosquito. We also use hair for things like thermal regulation, right? You have hair, and you can use it to help keep yourself warm, right? So maybe not so much with people, but if you think about like an animal, right, like a cat or a dog, when they get cold, they poof up, right? They poof up. That moving of the hair, right, traps warm air near the body, and that kind of works like a little kind of natural coat in a way. And then also communication, right? So like when the hair moves on the back of your neck, right, stands up, right, you're noticing something, you're kind of communicating something to some degree. We could see this with like a cat. Sorry, I'm a crazy cat lady. I gotta bring them up anytime I can. But you think about a cat, right? If you scare them, they poof up. They get that little, back, like get that little mohawk going down their back. Their tails poof up. They're communicating something. They're saying, hey, I don't like what you're doing. I don't like you, and I want nothing to do with you. And if you come near me, I'm gonna like mess you up, right? But that is what hair can do. We can communicate, right? In that case, in a social setting, right, with like something like an animal. So let's look at hair and kind of look at all the parts, because it's not just the hair hanging out there. There's a lot more that's going along with it. So we have our epidermis up here in this peach color. We have our dermis down in this pink color, and the hair, obviously has to extend through that epidermis, but it's going to dive all the way down into that dermis, right? And it's not just the hair. We have some of these other components, right? We have a sebaceous gland that hangs out with it that will add oil that can travel down the length of the hair, right? If you've ever had to go a while without washing your hair, you notice that it gets oily. You can thank those sebaceous glands for that. We have an erector pili muscle that is going to help pull that hair upright if we need to. So like we get cold, or if we are scared, right, we can use those to send our hair on end. Down here we have the hair bulb, right? The hair bulb is going to have some connections to some blood vessels and some nerve endings. And this is why, you can get your hair cut and it does not hurt, but if you get your hair yanked out, ooh, that is not nearly as okay, right? That definitely can hurt. And you might even see the actual bulb come with the hair if somebody pulls it out, right? So you can see all this coming out, but that's why it would hurt, because there's nerve endings and blood vessels that are going to be damaged when you remove a hair, right, in that case. We have the hair and the hair shaft, which has a few components, right? The cuticle on the very, very outside, the cortex and the medulla would be in the middle. You'll see cortex and medulla come back a few times, so you'll kind of want to remember that the cortex goes over the medulla. The medulla's closer to the middle there. And as we go down, we also see there's an inner root sheath, an outer root sheath, right, and a hair matrix, where we're going to then be kind of creating the hair, right? So there's going to be components, going to be cells in here that actually produce more hair so that your hair can grow. Right. Getting to the nails have their functions to protect the tips of our fingers and toes, because that's at the very ends of our extremities, and they're going to be used for tactile things, picking things up. There's a lot of more mechanical stress, right? There's a lot more risk involved with our fingertips and toes. If something falls on them or we're grabbing something, they're just more likely to be damaged. So we have these nails that will provide protection over our sensitive little tips of our fingers and toes. It also can help with picking things up, right? If you've ever had to pick up something especially very small or delicate, sometimes if you have longer nails, you can use your longer nails to pick those up without squishing it between your fingers. And so the nails, kind of like the hair too, is composed of dead keratinocytes. So kind of similar to your skin, right? It's going to be dead keratinocytes that are just packed together tight, 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 tight. So let's take a peek at a fingernail. In this case, we're going to look at it from the top down. We're also going to look at it as a sagittal cut to kind of see these different components. The free edge, that would be like the little white end of your nail that's kind of gone over the edge of your finger. Because it's not in contact with your skin, it's free, right? It's not attached to your skin, which is also why it has that white appearance. We have the nail itself, right? So the nail, and this nail is going to be attached to a nail bed. The lateral nail fold, right? That's going to be the edge, right, of where your nail kind of folds down into your skin. The lunula, which is this little half moon, hence luna, right? You think luna or lunar, like a little half moon right here. And then right down here where you would probably be taking care of your cuticles is the eponychium down here. And then right below that, right, we have the proximal nail fold. Right, so this is looking from the top down, but if we look at it from the side, right, again, we have that free edge. It's not in contact. This is the nail and nail body. There's that lunula, that would be that little kind of half moon you see down there. The eponychium, right, which is where like the skin kind of folds over. It's kind of like your cuticle area. And then some of the things we haven't seen yet, we have the proximal nail fold, which is like where the nail is kind of diving down under the skin. And then the nail root. The nail root is going to be where we're going to be growing the nail out from. Right, and this is why, you know, as long as the nail root or some of those cells remain, this nail can grow back even if you lose it all the way down under the skin here. Right, it'll take a long time for it to grow out because it's not a very fast process, but the only way to stop a nail from ever growing back is to literally destroy right here. And so if you've ever seen someone who like is had damage to their nail and they need it to be removed because it can't grow right, they'll actually use like a chemical, like they'll numb up the finger or the toe or whatever, and they'll use a chemical that actually is pushed down all the way to here to destroy the nail root here, because if they don't, it's going to grow back. Right? It's always going to grow back. The phalanx, this would be the bone inside the finger, dermis and epidermis, right? So we have our skin there, and then the hyponychium is going to be that under piece of skin that meets the edge of your nail. So if you look at underneath your nail, you'll notice that the skin touches, right, part of your nail on the underneath side. That's the hyponychium. All right, now getting into glands, we have sweat glands. Sweat glands mainly just are there to produce sweat so you can cool down. So it's hot out, we want to utilize water's ability to kind of pull heat energy from us, right? As water evaporates, it kind of pulls the heat energy from us, so that has a cooling effect on us, this evaporative effect. And so we have sweat glands to do that, to help us accomplish that. And there's two main types, eccrine and apocrine sweat glands. We've seen apocrine before, right? So eccrine, though, these ones are going to produce a hypotonic sweat for thermal regulation. So hypotonic, we're saying there's not a whole lot of solutes in it, right? Hypotonic, meaning it's going to be kind of watery. We see a lot of these in your hands, like the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and so you'll notice, like, if your palms get sweaty, you can thank the eccrine sweat glands there. And then the apocrine sweat glands, these tend to go hang out with the hair follicles, and so the sweat has a different appearance, right? The sweat is different. It has more organic compounds. The sweat is less watery. It's a little thicker, right? And so the apocrine sweat glands are also what's associated with the kind of smell of sweat. So eccrine sweat glands, you think kind of just like watery. It's not really producing much of a scent of anything. It's really just watery. But the apocrine sweat glands, these guys, because they have all these other organic compounds, bacteria enjoy eating those organic compounds. And so bacteria can like break those things down and produce smelly substances in response. And so when you think about like pit sweat, right, like underarm sweat, you're probably thinking apocrine sweat. Or if you're thinking like after working out and you're like, oh man, I smell like ripe, you can think apocrine sweat glands for that. We also have sebaceous glands that release sebum, which is like an oil. This is to help moisturize and lubricate the stratum corneum. And in some of this, we also have some antimicrobial properties as well in some of the oils that your skin releases. It's another way that you protect yourself from bacteria and viruses and whatnot. But there's actually an antimicrobial property to some of the oils that your skin releases, and this is one of the reasons why if you overwash your face, you can actually end up with breakouts. The reason being you're actually removing the antimicrobial components found in those oils and whatnot, giving the bacteria that end up on your skin free reign, right, to just do what they want. All right, getting into the next thing, we're going to talk about what are the functions of the integumentary system. We've talked a little bit about some of them right now, but we're going to get a little bit deeper, and we're also going to talk about some of the cool things that your skin can do to help maintain your body temperature, both to warm you up and cool you down. So one of the biggest things for the integumentary system as a whole is protection. It is your first line of defense against the environment, against microbes, right, against chemicals. It is the first thing that is going to protect you from damage. So we can protect against the elements like wind, water, UV light, right? We can protect against water loss because that keratin is in those dead cells, like in the epidermis. It's actually watertight, and so you're preventing water loss from that way. It's protection against abrasive activity, right? So we are handling chemical, or we are, touching something that might be a little rough, or microbes, or something that can cause physical damage. We have protection against that. And then, like I mentioned on the last slide, we actually do have antimicrobial components to our oils and sweat and whatnot that will basically prevent microbes from over-colonizing. Basically, they're not allowed to reproduce too much. So dermacidin, right, this is a compound that has antibiotic or antimicrobial properties that gets generated, goes on the skin surface, and it prevents microbes from overgrowing. We all have bacteria or microbes on all surfaces of us, like on the outside, but we don't want overgrowth. And so the oils and sweats that you produce can actually prevent that overgrowth. And like I said, if you are using overly harsh soaps, overly harsh washes, or you're washing too frequently, you could actually be stripping this particular thing away, which can then lead to that overgrowth of bacteria. Another thing that our integumentary system is responsible for is sensory input. We use our skin to get sensory information about the world around us, right? We have the senses of touch, right? So is something soft? Is something rough? Is it sharp? Is it bumpy? Is it smooth, right? We get all that information that way. We also get information about temperature. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it temperate, right? And then pain, unfortunately, but also fortunately, right? If something is sharp, right, we're going to know, right? So if I'm going to pot my plants and I decide to try to repot a cactus without gloves, I'm going to find out real quick that that's a bad idea, right? Because my skin is going to detect the pokiness of the cactus and send that to my brain in the form of pain, right? My brain's going to make sense of that in the form of pain. We have a couple different sensory organs. I already mentioned the Merkel cells before. We talked about those guys hanging out in the stratum basal. We also have Meissner corpuscles, which are for tactile stuff, and then the Pacinian corpuscles, which are the laminated corpuscles. So you might see, I think some places might just list it as the lamellated corpuscle as well, if I remember correctly. Alright, so here's one of those Meissner corpuscles in a picture, and it's kind of hard to tell it apart, but it's a slightly different color there, right here. So that would be our Meissner corpuscle. And so these guys are hanging out here. These guys are going to be helpful for determining, like, is something, are you touching something softly? Are you pressing down? So like pressure, vibration, great texture, things like that can help come from the Meissner corpuscles. All right, and then the last one, thermoregulation is a major function of the integumentary system. One of them we already talked about. We talked about sweating, right? It's summer, at least right now when I'm recording this. It's summer right now in Fresno. And so we're doing a lot of that sweating, right? But it's water, it's some salts, it's some other substances that get released with it. But one of the big things that sweating does is as that water evaporates, it's going to have a cooling effect on our skin. So it's kind of like pulling heat away from our body so that as the water evaporates, right, it dissipates off. But we can also thermoregulate in the opposite, right? If we're too cold. If we're too cold, we have shivering, right? Muscle contractions that help generate heat. You'll notice that you just start kind of shaking a little bit, right? That's that shivering. That is because all those little tiny muscle contractions actually create a little bit of heat, and that heat can then be used to keep you warm. And then another thing we can do is we can redistribute heat. Basically prevent heat from being lost through the surface of the skin by kind of redistributing blood flow mainly. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. So here we are with that. So this is what I mean when we're talking about how do we kind of redistribute body heat. So we have these blood vessels, right, that you can kind of see they have like levels, right? They can be deeper, or blood can flow up closer to the surface of the skin. If it's really cold out, we want to keep that heat as close, as deep as we can, right, to keep all the important bits going. And so we will basically shunt blood like to the deeper blood vessels so that we avoid the surface of the skin, right? So we're basically keeping blood from going all the way up here. That way blood stays deeper down in the body. We lose less body heat because as we get closer up here, some of that heat can dissipate out. We don't want that if it's super cold out. So we keep it close down here. On this side, right, it's July in Fresno, let's say, it's super hot. We need to get rid of some of that heat. We can have the blood flow all the way up here, up closer to the surface of the skin, and that's going to help dissipate that heat off so that we can keep ourselves cooler. Right, so it's kind of a cool technique, a cool thing that our skin can do besides the obvious, right? Because we always think of like shivering or sweating when we think thermoregulation, but this is something that you may not have even realized is going on to help you stay warm in the winter and cool in the summer. All right, another function, this one's probably one that you may have known about, but maybe not, and that is vitamin D synthesis. So vitamin D synthesis, you actually need a little bit of UV radiation exposure to be able to do this, but your skin can take things like cholesterol and convert it, synthesize vitamin D, right? So you have like a precursor, and then the UV radiation is utilized in the skin to convert it into vitamin D. And we need vitamin D because vitamin D goes hand in hand with calcium and phosphorus, which are some important ions we need. And so no vitamin D, you don't get a whole lot of calcium and phosphorus. You can't actually absorb it from your food very well. And so you'll see a lot of times too, things are fortified when it has calcium. It might have vitamin D added to it too, because you need them together, right? So you can make some of your vitamin D on your own though, just by going outside for a little bit. Now, it doesn't take very long though, right? So you don't need to be like going out and tanning. Don't take that as, this section here as permission to go out and tan. Tanning is still dangerous because that's way too much UV light exposure. But you do need some exposure to UV radiation to be able to make this conversion. Again, it's not very long. We're talking about probably enough. You probably do enough time outside in your daily life, walking to your car or in a parking lot, things like that. You don't need to go out and bake for like an hour a day. Don't do that. If you, for whatever reason, did not get a lot of sun exposure, you don't have enough vitamin D in your diet, you don't have enough vitamin D in the body, you can actually have a condition that's called rickets, right? And this can lead to like a bowing of the legs because the bones are just not healthy. Your bones, especially in the legs, which are carrying so much weight, are not healthy, and so you can end up with a bowing in the legs there. And vitamin D is also very helpful for general immunity. You may have heard that with things like COVID where people are taking vitamin D supplements. Having a ton of vitamin D isn't going to give you some superhuman immunity, but having too low a vitamin D will open up risks in terms of getting infections with bacteria or viruses or fungal infections. So you need to make sure you have enough vitamin D so that your immune system is performing at its peak. But throwing in a huge dose of vitamin D is not going to give you some sort of super shield with immunity. This whole thing here too, if we think of it from an evolutionary standpoint, is also one of the reasons why we see different skin types depending on where you are in the world. So if you are in areas that have a lot of UV light, you're getting exposed to a lot of it, namely think along the equator, you tend to find people who have darker skin tones because there's so much UV light. At that point, we shift from needing the UV light for vitamin D production to protection against damage. But if you go up north, right, and you go into like Scandinavia, so to speak, right, the UK, right, you go further north, you tend to find that historically people from those areas tend to have lighter skin tones. Why is that? There's not as much exposure to UV light, which means you need to have less melanin to be able to absorb that UV light to produce your vitamin D. So it really comes down to vitamin D versus cancer. In areas where there's less UV light exposure, skin tends to be lighter to be able to get more of that UV light to synthesize vitamin D. In areas where UV light is in overabundance, we don't need it's too much UV radiation exposure. We've made our vitamin D several times over. At this point now it's becoming harmful. You tend to find people who have more melanin to provide that protection.